Okay, I'd like to do a short piece on the Autovac 1920s fuel pump. And an Autovac consists of an outer chamber and an inner chamber, and the inner chamber creates a vacuum which sucks fuel from the fuel tank into the inner chamber, and through mechanical devices dumps it to the outer chamber and then out through an outlet valve and into the carburetor. So on the base of the Autovac we have an on-off tap for fuel to the supply to the carburetor, and a drain cock, because these things can get full of rubbish. So there's a drain cock. Now on the top end we have a lid with screws that hold the lid on, a petrol in, a fuel line in, an air vent, and the suction valve or induction valve. Now these valves are held onto this lid by a 3-fingered device that fits onto this screw piece here. Unfortunately on this one it's missing, but it will be replaced in due course. Now these valves are simply press fitted into these seatings here and can be difficult to remove, and the technique that I use is to put the lid into hot water and cold water, hot water, cold water, and eventually these will come free, and as you can see they're simply a press fit. And you can see that eventually these need to make an airtight seal on here. So cleanliness is absolutely important, so we will need to really clean these and this edge here, and if in doubt replace. This is the air vent, and as the inner chamber fills up, a needle opens the inner chamber to atmosphere, which breaks the suction and stops the pumping action and lets air in through this bell housing here. Various types of fittings for this, but they all do the same thing. They just let air in to break the suction. And this device here is the induction suction valve, and it's a one-way valve, and you can see it's got like holes on the bottom, and it's a one-way device. Now these can get plugged up with carbon and bits of rubbish, and eventually they'll stop working or reduce the suction. If you reduce the suction, you have very poor fuel flow, and this can be a lot of problems. This can give you a lot of problems. So if in doubt at all, change these valves. On this particular valve, which is a fuel inlet valve, when you connect it, there is a fine wire mesh thumb gauze which fits inside just to filter muck out of the fuel before it enters into the carburetor, into the fuel pump. I've removed most of the screws on this lid just for expediency, but I'll just take the last screw out, and then we'll break the lid out. Again, if the lid's difficult to get out, hot and cold will release it eventually. Inside here you have a float and an inner lid, which I'll come to in a second. You have gaskets, and if you look on the gasket there is an eccentric hole just there at the bottom, and on this lid here you can see there's a little pipe. This lets air into this outer tank. If that gets blocked, you'll lose fuel flow, so it's important to make sure that that is clean, and I'll go through the part on the lid in a second. This is the inner chamber and the outer chamber, and again these have gaskets on, so this facing needs to be clean and flat. We need to make an airtight seal. I can't emphasize that enough. We need to make an airtight seal. Don't use any sort of gasket goo on it. It doesn't need it, and it can fill these holes here and cause you problems. You have a look inside, you will see down the bottom gets quite messy with lots of bits of rust and particles. All this needs to be cleaned out and sealed. This container needs to be sealed if there's any leaks. And that's just that's just chamber that actually holds fuel for your engine to run. It's just a reservoir. Whereas this inner chamber creates a vacuum, so these seatings need to be made perfect with gaskets so there are no air leaks. The induction side sucks fuel through the inlet, through the induction side, out to the fuel tank, and sucks it into this chamber. And in this chamber we have a float which eventually will lift up and close the suction valve and open the device which lets air into the inner chamber, breaking the suction, stopping the pumping action, and at the same time, because the vacuum is broken, allows this valve here to, I'll turn it round, to open this valve here. You can see this valve opens and closes. This valve needs to be free. It needs to be able to actually move quite freely, and can get messed up, so it needs to be cleaned thoroughly till it works. This seating onto here needs to be clean because it needs to make an airtight seal there when it's held against there by the suction created from the induction side of the Autovac. Once it's closed, this inner chamber will start to fill with fuel, rising the float till it reaches a point inside here where two valves, you can see these move here and these valves move with it. On this particular model there's a spring goes between there and there, which is missing but will be replaced. And these valves here are like pin valves. They're not easy to see. You may be able to see them if I take these out here and turn it round, but they seat inside here. This one opens to atmosphere and stops the pump from pumping. This one and this one blocks the suction side and again stops it from bringing any fuel in. When the air side opens, it allows air into the inner chamber and allowing this flat valve to drop, spewing its contents of fuel into the outer reservoir, which is then stored for use by your car. It is absolutely important that this inner chamber is airtight. You must check to see there are no potholes or pinprick holes to allow air in. If you do, and you have air getting into this system, no matter how small, it will reduce the suction of fuel and you will have fuel delivery problems. So again, this needs to be working properly, and when it's seated back in the system, needs to be airtight on these joints. So don't mess around with these old gaskets. Replace with new gaskets. These are the screws to the lid. You may be able to see them. Don't over tighten. They're easy to break the threads. You shouldn't need to. With new gaskets, and if the head is and if the facing is flat and clean, it will make an airtight seal. If you put gunk onto this sealant, you have a pretty good chance of drawing some into here, through this flap, out through the outlet into your carburetor, and can bung up all your carburetor. And secondly, this air valve here, which has to remain open all the time to let atmosphere to this outer chamber, if that gets bunged up with gunk, your system won't work or will work very inefficiently. It is really important to make sure these airways are clear. Again, with the with the float. Confirm that there's no leaks in the float by simply putting it into hot water, but only to the top level, and to see if there's any air bubbles come out. If it's fine at that level, then it's sealed and it's fine. You can maybe able to see there's a small hole. That actually is a self-draining hole and will drain the float if it gets fuel into it. This device here is where your fuel in, and these two devices, this devices here, as we said before, are just two lift valves that open and close the air and the induction side. If these valves need to be replaced, because you ought to be able to seal them, holding up, and you ought to be able to seal. One should blow through and one should seal. If they're not, replace them. How I replace them is, these are soldered. You have to unsolder it. They're a threaded screw, so just literally unscrew it, count the turns, replace with the same number of turns and resolder. There's not really much more to this system than that. So when we put the system together, it is really important that we put new gaskets on the facings, that these eccentric hole here for this air hole literally fits onto there. The lid only goes in one way, and as you can see, it's got a hole for that eccentric device there, and it needs to fit onto it. Once that's down, we can screw it together. Again, new gaskets. Again, to replace these valves, lap them in and make sure you've got the right one in the right hole. The petrol one is just a straight through elbow. The induction side has a non-return on it. They're not interchangeable. So put that into the suction side. That's the air valve, various types as I've said, but all do the same thing. They just allow air into the inner chamber to break the suction and to stop the pumping. They fit in there. These need to make an airtight seal, so just lap them in a little bit until they're nice and clean and reasonably tight, and the finger lock fits onto the edges of these here and just pulls them in. That's all there is to that. There's nothing more to an Autovac than that. It's a very simple procedure. Again, just to emphasize, you must not have any air leaks in that inner chamber or the pipe work between the induction valve, the induction inlet and your engine block, and the fuel. If you've got fuel leaks, you will have petrol problems. The whole of the system needs to be a vacuum. If you've got any air leaks coming into the system, you will have reduced fuel flow, and you will have problems at the carburetor with fuel and popping back or running out of fuel. And that really is an Autovac.